Welcome to Starbound Fantasy channel. My name is Aurum, and I'll be your narrator today. Please check to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and just allows our stories to pop up on your feed more often. The firestone set into the wall glowed blue-hot as Phinia ducked beneath them, wincing at the heat. The dwarven city of Khaz'Gorum spread before her like a subterranean galaxy, a sprawling network of cavernous halls illuminated by 1,000 fires and bizarre glowing crystals that defied description. Nothing about Khaz'Gorum could be considered small, despite its diminutive inhabitants.
Sweet gods, do they ever let the forges rest?
Phinia muttered, tugging her threadbare cloak tighter around her shoulders. The copper-red hair that had earned her so many nicknames, fox hair, ember head, flame kissed, was tightly bound beneath a hood. Not that it would do much good. Half-elves stood out in dwarven lands like splinters in a smith's thumb. A passing dwarf, his beard woven with silver chains, shot her a glance of pure contempt.
Got a map in those whiskers?
Phinia called after him.
Or just generations of prejudice?
His muscled back stiffened, but he didn't turn. No matter. She'd long since given up caring about such petty hatreds. From deeper within the city came the thunderous sound of drums, their tempo quickening. The Ironbreaker tournament was beginning, which meant the streets would be flooded with dwarves from every clan in the realm. And where there were excited dwarves, there was mead. And where there was mead, there were songs. And songs meant copper in Phinia's pouch and a warm bed for the month. This was why the Wanderer wandered, after all. She followed the vibration of the drums down the sloping tunnels carved with angular runes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The deeper she went, the more crowded the passages became. Soon she found herself caught in the crush of dwarven bodies, a sea of elaborately braided beards, gleaming ceremonial armor, and the occasional flash of gemstones. Their excitement was a palpable thing, radiating like heat from a forge. Making her way through the throng, Phinia managed to slip past a distracted guard into a circular chamber where the crowd thinned considerably. Fine tapestries lined the walls, depicting ancient battles against giants, dragons, and creatures she couldn't name. The room smelled of lichen wine and expensive oils.
You're not supposed to be here,
said a smooth voice. Phinia turned to face a female dwarf wearing ceremonial robes embroidered with silver thread. The dwarf's beard was short but intricate, woven with tiny pearls that caught the light.
I'm the new entertainment,
Phinia lied without hesitation.
Sent by Guildmaster Thorback himself. He said the visiting dignitaries might enjoy some elvish melodies.
The dwarf's dark eyes narrowed.
Thorback wouldn't hire an elf if his beard was on fire and you had the only water. Half-elf,
Phinia corrected, pulling the stolen bottle from her pack.
And I've bought a gift. A rare vintage from the gardens of Elendel. Perhaps it might sweeten your disposition toward foreign music?
The dwarf's eyes widened at the sight of the delicate crystal bottle filled with liquid that seemed to capture moonlight in its depths. Elvish wine was rare and expensive. Most elves didn't trade with outsiders at all.
Where did you get that?
The dwarf asked, voice hushed. Phinia allowed a smile to play across her lips.
I won it in a game of chance from a high elf who'd had far too much of your people's delightful mead. A fair exchange, I'd say.
This was a lie. Phinia had stolen the bottle from an elvish merchant's wagon while he slept, but the story of winning it sounded better. Less criminal, more roguish. The dwarf considered for a long moment before taking the bottle.
There are quarters for the performers at the end of the hall. Keep your hood up and don't make trouble.
She shot Phinia a stern look.
And if anyone asks, you're 1/4 elvish at most.
Phinia bowed with exaggerated grace.
I'll be the very soul of discretion.
And that's how Phinia the Wanderer secured lodgings meant for acclaimed musicians and noble visitors, all for the price of a stolen bottle of wine. As victories went, it wasn't epic, but it would do for now. The great hall of Khaz'Gorum easily held 10,000 dwarves, and tonight it seemed every one of them had come to celebrate the tournament's opening feast. Massive pillars carved from living stone supported a vaulted ceiling so high that clouds had formed near its apex. Long tables groaned under the weight of food and drink, roast meats, mushroom pies, loaves of dense bread, and barrels of mead and ale. Phinia had situated herself on a small platform with other musicians, her mismatched eyes, one green, one amber, scanning the crowd while her fingers plucked idle notes from her silverwood lute. The instrument, her most prized possession, had been a gift from a dying human minstrel who'd claimed to be her father. Whether that was true or not, Phinia had never been able to verify, but the lute produced sweeter notes than any she'd ever heard. At the end of the hall sat the elite of dwarven society, clan leaders, master craftsmen, and this year's champions. Each champion displayed their weapon of choice on the table before them, a tradition dating back centuries. The array was impressive. An axe with a head that shimmered like liquid mercury, a warhammer inlaid with rubies that caught the firelight, a pair of matching blades with edges so thin they seemed to vanish when viewed from certain angles. But all eyes were drawn to the weapon belonging to Durnham's Steel Splitter, the reigning champion. He was a mountain of a dwarf, nearly 5 feet tall, with muscles that bulged beneath his ceremonial armor. His beard was a cascade of red gold, braided with platinum rings that commemorated his victories. Before him lay an axe that seemed to drink in light. Its head was forged from a blue-black metal that almost appeared fluid despite its solidity. The handle was wrapped in what looked like dragon hide, and runes glowed faintly along its length. "Heartrender," whispered a nearby musician, noticing Phinia's stare. "Forged from star metal that fell during the Century of Fire. They say it can cleave through solid stone like butter."
I've heard more impressive boasts about less impressive weapons,
Phinia replied with a practiced nonchalance. In truth, the axe both fascinated and disturbed her. Something about it seemed hungry. The feast was reaching its peak, with several dwarves standing on tables to propose elaborate toasts to their champions, when a disturbance rippled through the crowd near the entrance. Conversations died mid-sentence. The musicians faltered. Even the servers paused in their duties. A lone figure stood in the arched doorway, silhouetted against the torchlight from the corridor beyond. He was clearly human, tall and lean compared to the stocky dwarves, with dark hair pulled back into a simple top knot. He wore plain gray robes that had seen better days, and his only possession appeared to be a wooden staff. The silence lasted precisely 3 heartbeats before the hall erupted in laughter. It rolled across the chamber like thunder, bouncing off the stone walls and ceiling. Phinia winced. Dwarves weren't known for their subtlety. The human remained motionless, his face impassive, until the laughter began to die down. Then he walked forward, his movements fluid and precise. The crowd parted before him, some dwarves still chuckling, others eyeing the newcomer with open disdain. He stopped before the high table and bowed, not deeply, but with respect. "I am Wei," he said simply. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the now hushed hall. "I wish to enter the Ironbreaker tournament." Fresh laughter, crueler this time. Someone threw a crust of bread that narrowly missed the human's head. Durnham's Steel Splitter rose to his feet, towering over the seated dwarves around him. "With what?" he boomed, gesturing at the wooden staff in Wei's hand. "The glorified walking stick!" Wei inclined his head slightly. "Yes." The champion's face reddened beneath his beard. "This is not some human fair where jesters compete for copper coins. This is the Ironbreaker tournament, the oldest and most sacred contest of martial skill in the realm." "I am aware," Wei replied. "Are you?" Durham's voice dripped with mockery. "Then you know that for 1,000 years, champions have tested their mettle in this hall. They bring weapons forged by the greatest smiths, passed down through generations, blessed by the old gods themselves." He pointed at Wei's staff. "And you bring wood!" Wei said nothing, simply maintaining his calm stance. "Let him compete," called a voice from the crowd. Phinea's gaze snapped to an elderly dwarf seated at a side table. The old one's beard was wispy and white, and her eyes were clouded with blindness, but her voice was strong. "The laws are clear. Any weapon may be tested. Let the tournament decide." A murmur ran through the hall. The blind dwarf was right. The ancient rules stated that all challengers must be allowed to prove themselves, regardless of origin or station. It was a point of pride among the dwarves that their champions could defeat any challenger with any weapon. Thrain Ironclaw, ruler of Khaz'Gorum, stood. Unlike Durham, he was not imposing in stature, but his elaborate beard harness, containing samples of every metal the dwarves could work, marked him as the most powerful dwarf present. "Very well," he said, his tone making it clear he found the situation amusing rather than offensive. "The human may enter." He turned to Wei. "Though I hope you've brought a sturdy stretcher for after your first match." Wei bowed again, then turned and walked from the hall without another word. The feast resumed, but now with a new topic of conversation. The foolish human, who would soon learn the cost of his hubris. Phinia, however, had noticed something that the others had missed. The staff the monk carried had looked ordinary at first glance, but as he'd turned to leave, the light had caught it strangely. For just a moment, patterns seemed to move beneath its polished surface, like currents in a deep river. She'd seen many things in her travels, genuine wonders and elaborate frauds alike. She'd sung about legendary weapons and mythical heroes, embellishing the tales to please her audience, often knowing the truth was far more mundane. But something about the quiet monk and his wooden staff had awakened her curiosity, and curiosity had always been Phinia's weakness, or perhaps her strength. Either way, it had led her into trouble more times than she could count. She slipped away from the musician's platform, following the path the human had taken. If there was a story here, she wanted to be the one to tell it. And if not, well, at least watching a human get thrashed by dwarven champions would make for an entertaining afternoon. The next morning dawned, not that anyone could tell underground, with the clanging of bells and the beating of drums. Phinia had spent the night following Wei through the city, keeping to the shadows and observing him from a distance. He had found a small alcove in one of the less-traveled corridors and spent hours in silent meditation, the staff balanced across his knees. He hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't even appeared to breathe deeply. Now, as she walked through the crowds toward the tournament grounds, Phinia's mind churned with questions. Why would a human monk travel all this way just to be humiliated? What was special about the staff, and why did the blind dwarf speak up for him? The preliminary rounds of the tournament were held in a series of smaller arenas surrounding the main battling pit, allowing multiple matches to occur simultaneously. Dwarves pushed and shoved for better viewing positions, placing bets and arguing about the merits of the various champions. Phinia worked her way through the throng, stopping occasionally to sing ribald songs about metalwork that made the dwarves roar with laughter. A few copper coins were tossed her way, which she deftly caught without missing a beat. By midday, she had earned enough to guarantee a meal and a few drinks, and, more importantly, had secured a prime viewing spot for Wei's first match. His opponent was a young dwarf with a confident swagger and twin axes that glinted in the torchlight. The crowd cheered as he entered the ring, spinning his weapons with flashy swipes. When Wei stepped into the arena, there were jeers and catcalls. The monk acknowledged neither, simply holding his staff in a relaxed grip. A gong sounded, and the dwarf attacked immediately, axes whirling in a deadly pattern as he charged across the stone floor. Wei moved, or perhaps flowed would be a better description. He seemed to glide sideways, the staff in his hands redirecting one axe and simply not being where the other struck. The dwarf stumbled, thrown off balance by hitting nothing but air when he'd expected resistance. Before he could recover, Wei had moved again, this time using the staff to lightly tap the dwarf's shoulder as he passed. It wasn't a strike so much as a reminder. I could have hit you, but chose not to. The crowd fell silent, confused. The dwarf turned, his face flushed with anger, and attacked again. This time his moves were less controlled, driven by frustration. Wei continued his pattern of redirection, never making direct contact with the axes, never striking the dwarf directly. It was like watching water flow around rocks in a stream. This continued for several minutes, with the dwarf growing increasingly exhausted while Wei remained fresh. Finally, the gong sounded again. The match was over, decided not by knockout or surrender, but by the simple fact that one combatant could not continue. The dwarf collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, his axes suddenly looking too heavy to lift. Wei bowed to his opponent, then to the officials, and exited the arena without celebration. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some booed, calling the match a disgrace. Others whispered among themselves, clearly unsettled by what they'd witnessed. None seemed to know quite what to make of a fighting style that involved no actual fighting.
Cowardice, spat a nearby dwarf. He didn't land a single blow.
He didn't need to,
Phinia replied, earning a glare.
Why exhaust yourself striking when your opponent will do it for you?
That's not how battles are won,
the dwarf insisted. Phinia shrugged.
Seems like he just won one.
As the day progressed, Wei's subsequent matches followed the same pattern. Opponents attacked, he evaded. They tired, he remained calm. The crowd grew increasingly hostile, feeling cheated of the spectacle of combat they'd expected. But Phinia noticed something else. A small contingent of older dwarves, including the blind one who had spoken at the feast, watched Wei's matches with intense focus. They didn't jeer or complain. Instead, they observed with expressions that ranged from shock to what almost seemed like reverence. Between matches, Phinia approached one of these observers, a gray-bearded dwarf with calloused hands and burn scars that suggested decades at a forge.
Not much of a show, is it?
She asked casually, testing the waters. The dwarf gave her a measuring look.
Depends on what you're looking for.
Most seem to want blood and broken bones.
Most are fools,
the dwarf replied quietly.
They've forgotten what the tournament was meant to test.
And what's that?
The old dwarf shook his head.
Ask Grimna. She remembers the old ways.
He nodded toward the blind female dwarf who sat nearby, her clouded eyes somehow still tracking Wei's movements across the arena. Phinia made a mental note of the name. Then, tuning her lute, she began to play and sing, but not the bawdy songs that pleased the crowd earlier. Instead, she sang an ancient ballad about a hero who defeated a giant not with strength, but with cleverness. It was a song she'd learned from an old human woman in a mountain village, one that few in these halls would recognize. But the blind dwarf's head turned at the first notes, and a small smile creased her wrinkled face. By nightfall, rumors about the strange human and his unorthodox fighting style had spread throughout Khaz'Gorum. Some said he was using elvish trickery or dark magic. Others claimed the staff was enchanted to make his opponents weak. Still others insisted it was all a joke, a mockery of the sacred tournament. Phinia listened to it all, storing away details for the ballad she had already begun composing in her head. But she wanted more, the truth behind the whispers, the story beneath the surface. And for that, she needed to speak with two people. Grimna, the blind lorekeeper, and Wei himself. Finding Wei proved easier. After his last match of the day, he returned to the same alcove where he had spent the previous night. Phinia followed at a distance, then approached openly, her lute slung across her back.
"That was quite a performance today,"
she said without preamble. Wei opened his eyes but didn't rise from his cross-legged position. The staff lay across his knees, looking for all the world like an ordinary piece of wood. "I did not perform," he replied. "I simply moved as needed."
"Well, whatever you call it, you've got half the city calling for your head and the other half convinced you're using dark magic."
"And you? What do you think?" Phinia studied him more closely. His face was difficult to age. Smooth, but with eyes that suggested wisdom beyond youth. His hands, resting lightly on the staff, bore strange calluses that didn't match any weapon training she was familiar with.
"I think there's more to that staff than meets the eye,"
she said finally.
"The way you carry it suggests weight, but you move it like it's weightless. And there are markings on it that seem to shift."
Wei's expression remained impassive. "You see clearly."
"I see what others miss. It's a useful skill in my line of work."
"And what work is that?" Phinia grinned.
"I collect stories, shape them, and sell them back to people more beautifully than they were found. Some call it lying. I prefer to think of it as improving on reality."
"A dangerous occupation."
Says the man who walked into a dwarven stronghold with nothing but a wooden staff to challenge their greatest champions.
She leaned against the wall.
"Why are you here? Really?"
Wei was silent for a long moment. "I follow the staff," he said at last. "It guides me where I must go."
"That's cryptic."
"It is truth." Before Phinia could press further, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. A group of dwarven guards approached, their beards and armor marking them as part of the elite palace guard.
"Human,"
the lead guard announced gruffly.
"Champion Durham Steelsplitter extends an invitation to dine with him this evening."
The way he emphasized invitation made it clear this was a command, not a request. Wei nodded once and rose fluidly to his feet, staff in hand. As the guard surrounded him and led him away, he glanced back at Phinia with an unreadable expression. Phinia waited until they had turned the corner, then followed silently. A private dinner with the reigning champion on the eve of what would likely be their match? That wasn't hospitality. It was something else entirely, and she intended to find out what. But first, she had another visit to make. The lorekeeper Grimna might hold the keys to understanding what was really happening in Khaz'Gorum, and Phinia had never been able to resist a locked door, especially one hiding a good story. Finding Grimna proved more challenging than tracking Wei. The blind lorekeeper didn't reside in the public quarters of Khaz'Gorum, but in the deeper, older sections of the city. Phinia had to bribe and charm her way past several checkpoints, inventing increasingly elaborate excuses for why she needed access to the restricted areas.
I'm composing a special anthem for the tournament winner,
she told one guard.
Lord Thrain himself requested research into the ancient victory songs. The ambassador requested rare herbs that only grow in the lower caverns,
she explained to another,
for a diplomatic gift.
By the time she reached the archives, a vast chamber filled with stone tablets, scrolls, and strangely glowing crystals that contained recorded memories, Phinia had spun so many tales she could barely keep track of them all. The archive was largely empty. Few dwarves visited on the best of days, and with the tournament underway, even the scholars had abandoned their studies for the excitement of the contests. Only a single figure remained, hunched over a table near the back of the chamber. Grimna, her wispy white beard reflecting the soft light of the memory crystals.
"You're late,"
the blind dwarf said without turning.
"I expected you hours ago."
Phinia froze mid-step.
"You knew I was coming?" "I've known since you sang that old ballad. No one here remembers the clever hand anymore."
Grimna's fingers traced patterns across an ancient tablet.
"Only those who seek the old knowledge would know such a song."
Phinia approached cautiously.
"And is that why you think I'm here? For old knowledge? Why else would you follow the monk and his staff?"
Grimna turned, her clouded eyes somehow focusing directly on Phinia.
"You sense what others have forgotten how to see." "And what's that?" "Balance."
The dwarf gestured to the seat beside her.
"Sit, halfling. Ask your questions. Time grows short."
Phinia sat, studying the old dwarf more closely. Grimna's robes were rough spun, but adorned with subtle runes that matched those she'd glimpsed on Way's staff. A walking stick leaned against her chair, carved with similar markings.
"What is Way's staff?"
Phinia asked directly.
"It's not just wood, is it?"
Grimna's laugh was a dry, rustling sound, like autumn leaves.
"It is exactly just wood. That is its power and its purpose."
She ran gnarled fingers over the tablet before her.
"Before we retreated underground, before we fell in love with metal and fire, dwarves carved our most sacred tools from the roots of the world tree. Yggdrasil, some called it. We understood then what we've forgotten now, that true strength comes from balance, not dominance." "I don't understand." "Of course not. You're young, and the world has lost its memory."
Grimna sighed.
"The staff your monk carries was not made by him or his kind. It was carved eons ago by my ancestors from a branch of a guardian tree that grows at the nexus point, a place where the barriers between worlds are thin, where elemental forces converge." "So, it is magical?" "In a sense. Such wood absorbs the essence of what surrounds it, growing stronger over centuries. It cannot be broken by conventional means. It cannot burn. It endures."
The old dwarf's voice grew soft with reverence.
"There were once many such weapons, used not to conquer but to bring about peace and stability in the world. But as we dwarfs retreated beneath the mountains, we abandoned the old ways. We forgot. We fell in love with the song of metal and the dance of fire." "And the ruling clans?"
Phinia prompted.
"Did they merely forget, or—" "They suppressed,"
Grimna whispered harshly.
"Thrain's ancestors built their power on metallurgy, on weapons that could destroy rather than preserve. The old ways threatened their supremacy, so the knowledge was buried, the remaining wood-crafted items destroyed or hidden."
She gestured around at the archive.
"Even here in our repository of knowledge, you'll find no mention of the guardian trees or the weapons carved from them. I keep what remains of that wisdom here."
She tapped her temple.
"Then how did Way come to possess such a staff?" His order of monks has served as guardians for ages, keeping safe what others would destroy. They have temples built around the remaining guardian trees.
Grimna leaned forward.
But the world is changing. The balance shifts. The monk was sent on a pilgrimage to return the staff to sacred sites around the world, places where the old magic has been forgotten, to remind them. Remind them of what? Of what came before, of what must come again if we are to survive.
Phineas sat back, trying to absorb this information.
And Khaz'Gorum sits on one such site.
Grimna nodded.
Deep beneath this mountain lies a nexus point, a convergence of ley lines. Our ancestors built the city here precisely because of that power. But instead of working with it, we now mine through it, disrupt it, poison it with our forges. And tomorrow we will face Durham in the final match.
Phineas mused.
Wood against metal. More than that,
Grimna said, her voice suddenly urgent.
The old against the new, balance against dominance.
She gripped Phineas' arm with surprising strength.
And when it happens, when Heartrender meets the staff, something will change. The Nexus will respond, the mountain itself will awaken.
That sounds ominous.
Change always is.
The blind dwarf released her grip.
Now go. The champion's dinner with the monk is not what it appears. Your voice will be needed there.
Phineas stood, her mind reeling with implications.
Why tell me all this? I'm just a wandering bard. I have no power here.
Grimna smiled, the expression transforming her ancient face.
Because you will carry the story forward when it's done. And stories, child, have their own kind of power.
She turned back to her tablet.
Besides, I've been waiting 8 decades for someone to come along who knows the words to the clever hand. I wasn't about to waste the opportunity.
Phineas left the archives with more questions than answers, but with a sense of urgency driving her steps. If Grimna was right, and something in the old dwarf's voice had rung with absolute conviction, then Wei was walking into a trap. And somehow, Phineas had become part of a story much larger and older than she'd imagined. She moved quickly through the tunnels, heading toward the private dining halls where Durham would be hosting his guest. For once, she wasn't thinking about the songs she might create from this adventure or the coins those songs might earn. Something deeper pulled her forward, a sense that she was witnessing the turning of a wheel that had been still for too long. The private dining chamber reserved for champions was opulent by dwarven standards. Walls inlaid with precious metals, chairs carved from single pieces of obsidian, a table of polished granite. Phineas had used a combination of charm, misdirection, and outright lies to secure a position among the servers, donning the traditional gray robes and keeping her head bowed. Durham sat at the head of the table, his legendary axe Heartrender positioned prominently beside him. Wei sat opposite, his staff balanced across his lap beneath the table. Between them were platters of roasted meats, exotic fungi, and breads so dense they seemed carved rather than baked. Pitchers of dark dwarven ale stood ready. They were not alone. A half-dozen of Durham's supporters flanked him, each a powerful figure in Khaz'Gorum's hierarchy. Thrain Ironclaw was noticeably absent, but Phineas recognized his chief advisor among the gathered dwarves.
Drink, human!
Durham urged, his voice booming even in the confined space.
It's not every day a man gets to taste the finest ale in the mountain.
Wei inclined his head politely, but didn't touch the proffered drink. I thank you for your hospitality, champion, but I observe certain restrictions before combat. Durham's beard quivered with barely suppressed irritation.
Restrictions? Bah! A true warrior celebrates before battle, during battle, and after battle.
He drained his own tankard and slammed it down.
But I suppose humans have different constitutions.
The dwarves around him chuckled darkly. Phinia, moving around the table with a pitcher, noted that Durnham's eyes remained cold and calculating despite his jovial tone. This wasn't a social gathering. It was a calculated move in a game the monk seemed either unaware of or indifferent to.
I admit curiosity,
Durnham continued, helping himself to a haunch of meat.
What brings a human monk to our sacred tournament? Surely not the glory or the prizes. Both would mean little to one of your calling.
I follow the staff,
Wei replied simply.
It guides me where it wishes to go.
One of the dwarves snorted.
He speaks as if the wood controls him, not the other way around.
Perhaps it does,
Wei said.
Do you control your axe, or does it control your purpose?
The chamber fell silent. Durnham's face darkened, and Phinia tensed, ready to move if the situation turned violent.
An interesting philosophy,
a new voice interrupted. The chief advisor leaned forward, eyes gleaming with interest.
But I wonder, is such a passive weapon worthy of our tournaments? The Ironbreaker challenges are tests of strength, of the superiority of dwarven metallurgy. Your staff hasn't struck a single blow in any of your matches.
Strength takes many forms,
Wei replied.
As does superiority.
Durnham's fist crashed onto the table, making Platters jump.
Enough cryptic nonsense. Tomorrow you face me in the final match. I will not be exhausted by chasing you around the ring like your previous opponents. Heartrender will taste your blood, and all will see the folly of bringing wood to challenge steel.
Wei met the champion's furious gaze with calm eyes.
We shall see what tomorrow brings.
Unless, the advisor interjected smoothly,
you were to reconsider your participation. There will be no dishonor in withdrawing before the final round. In fact, we could arrange a substantial compensation for your journey here. A gesture of goodwill from Khaz'Gorum to the human lands.
Phinia nearly dropped her pitcher. They were trying to bribe the monk to withdraw.
I cannot withdraw,
Wei said simply.
The staff has business here.
Durnham's patience snapped.
Your staff has no business here except to be broken!
He rose, towering over the table.
Perhaps I should save us all the trouble and break it now!
Before anyone could react, the champion lunged across the table and seized Wei's staff. The monk made no move to stop him, his expression unchanged as Durnham held the wooden shaft aloft.
Let's see how special this stick really is!
Durnham snarled. He brought the staff down against his knee with tremendous force, force enough to shatter steel. The sound that followed wasn't the crack of breaking wood, but a pure, bell-like tone that reverberated through the chamber. Durnham howled in pain, dropping the staff and clutching his knee as if he'd struck it against solid stone. In the silence that followed, Wei calmly retrieved his staff from the floor.
The staff cannot be broken by one who does not understand it,
he said quietly.
Just as truth cannot be destroyed by one who refuses to see it.
Durnham's face contorted with rage and embarrassment.
Guards!
He bellowed.
Seize him! This human brings sorcery into our halls!
Armored dwarves burst through the doors, weapons drawn. Phinia, acting on instinct, overturned the heavy table, creating momentary chaos. Food, drink, and startled dwarves tumbled in all directions.
This way!
She hissed, grabbing Wei's arm and pulling him toward a servant's exit nearly hidden in the wall's ornate carvings.
They'll kill you before you reach the arena tomorrow.
To her surprise, the monk allowed himself to be led, moving with her through the narrow passage as shouts and the clatter of armor filled the chamber behind them.
You know another way out?
Wei asked as they hurried through the dimly lit corridor.
I know many ways out,
Phinia replied.
It's my second best talent.
And your first?
She flashed him a grin over her shoulder.
getting into trouble worth escaping from.
As they disappeared into the labyrinthine service tunnels of Khaz'Gorum, the alarm bells began to ring throughout the mountain city. The final match of the Ironbreaker tournament had started early, and now it would be played across the entire stronghold.
We need to get you out of the mountain,
Phinia whispered as they crouched in a storage alcove, listening to the sound of dwarven search parties echoing through nearby tunnels. They'd been evading capture for hours, working their way steadily downward through increasingly ancient passages.
No,
Wei replied.
the staff must complete its task.
Do you miss the part where they're trying to kill you?
Phinia hissed.
Whatever your staff needs to do, it won't happen if you're dead.
Wei's calm expression didn't waver.
If that is how events unfold, another time will come for me. The staff will find its way.
Gods, you're infuriating.
Phinia muttered.
At least tell me what this mysterious task is so I'll know if it's worth dying for.
The monk was silent for a long moment, his eyes closed as if listening to something only he could hear. Finally, he opened them and looked directly at Phinia.
The staff was carved from a guardian tree that grows at a convergence of ley lines, rivers of power that flow through the world. Such trees absorb the essence of the elements around them, becoming living repositories of ancient magic.
He ran his hand along the staff's length, and Phinia saw the subtle markings glow briefly at his touch.
My order has protected these artifacts for centuries, keeping them safe as the world forgot the old magics in favor of newer, more destructive powers. But now the balance shifts too far. The nexus points, places where ley lines converge, grow unstable. The barriers between worlds thin dangerously.
And Khaz'Gorum sits on such a nexus,
Phinia said, remembering Grimna's words. Wei nodded.
The dwarves built here precisely because of that power, though they've forgotten why. Their mining and forging disrupts the flow of energies. The staff must be present at the exact center of the nexus, the tournament ring, during a moment of significant symbolic action.
like a championship duel between wood and metal,
Phinia mused.
Yes, when Heartrender strikes the staff directly, before witnesses who represent the old and new ways, it will create a resonance that will reawaken the mountain's awareness, remind it of what was forgotten.
Remind a mountain? Mountains don't have memories.
Wei smiled slightly.
Don't they? The stones beneath us are older than any living being. They've absorbed the energies of countless ages. In a sense, they remember better than we do.
A shout from a nearby tunnel interrupted their conversation. The search parties were getting closer.
We need to move,
Phinia urged.
Is there another way to reach the center of this nexus without going through the main arena?
Wei closed his eyes again, this time holding the staff out before him. It seemed to tug slightly in a specific direction.
The staff knows the way,
he said.
but it may not be a path meant for the living.
Wonderful.
Phinia muttered.
Follow the magical stick into certain doom. This will make for a fantastic final verse to my ballad, assuming anyone lives to hear it.
They slipped from their hiding place, following the staff's subtle guidance deeper into the mountain. The passages grew older, the carvings more primitive. Soon they were traversing tunnels that seemed to have formed naturally, without dwarven intervention.
The old ones built around the mountain's natural features,
Wei explained as they squeezed through a narrow fissure.
They understood that true craft works with the world, not against it. If you start lecturing me on the philosophical superiority of wood over metal, I'm turning around,
Phinia warned, though there was no real heat in her words. Despite herself, she was fascinated by the monk's quiet certainty and the ancient story unfolding around them. The passage widened suddenly, opening into a vast cavern unlike any Phinia had seen in Khaz'Gorum. No artificial lights illuminated this space. Instead, crystals embedded in the walls and ceiling glowed with a soft blue radiance that seemed to pulse in time with some unheard rhythm. The floor was a perfectly circular platform of polished stone, carved with intricate patterns that matched the markings on Wei's staff.
By all the gods,
Phinia breathed.
what is this place?
The true heart of the mountain, Wei replied, his voice hushed with reverence.
The center of the nexus. The first dwarves built their sacred spaces here before they began to dig and forge.
He stepped onto the circular platform, and the patterns beneath his feet glowed brighter in response. The staff in his hands hummed with energy, its markings now clearly visible.
This is where the final match was always meant to be fought,
Wei continued.
Not in the arena above, but here, where the energies converge.
Phinia followed him onto the platform, feeling a strange tingling sensation as she crossed its boundary.
If that's true, then Durnham needs to be here too, and that seems unlikely given he's currently trying to have you killed.
The words had barely left her mouth when a new sound echoed through the cavern, the unmistakable tread of heavy dwarven boots. A moment later, torchlight spilled into the chamber as a group of armed figures entered from a tunnel opposite their position. At their head stood Durnham Steelsplitter, Heartrender gleaming in his grasp. Beside him was Thrain Ironclaw, his elaborate beard harness catching the crystal light. And behind them, to Phinia's shock, came Grimna, supported by her walking stick.
It seems we've all found our way to the true heart of Khaz'Gorum,
the blind lorekeeper observed.
Just as the old prophecies foretold.
The opposing groups faced each other across the glowing circular platform, neither advancing immediately. The crystal light cast strange shadows, making familiar faces seem alien and ancient.
What prophecies?
Thrain demanded, turning to Grimna.
You said nothing of prophecies when you insisted we follow these tunnels.
The blind dwarf smiled serenely.
Would you have come if I had? You've spent decades suppressing the old knowledge, hiding the truth of our origins from our people. Why would prophecies move you now?
Treachery,
Durnham growled.
There's the human with his enchanted staff. And now this.
He raised Heartrender.
Let's finish what we started at dinner.
Wait!
Phinia interjected, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her.
Before anyone starts swinging weapons in a place literally glowing with strange magic, perhaps we should understand what's actually happening here.
And who are you to interfere?
Thrain asked coldly.
A half-breed vagabond who snuck into our city under false pretenses.
I'm Phinia the Wanderer,
she replied, drawing herself up.
And yes, I've spun my share of tales and stolen my share of wine, but right now I think I might be the only person here without an agenda.
She gestured around the chamber.
Something ancient is waking up, and I'd prefer not to be crushed when it stretches.
Grimna laughed softly.
The bard speaks wisdom. We stand at a threshold moment, a time when the path of our people could change.
She turned her clouded eyes toward Thrain.
You've led us deeper into the mountain, deeper into our obsession with metal and dominance. You've helped us forget the balance we once maintained.
I've led our people to prosperity and security,
Thrain shot back.
The old ways kept us weak, dependent on fickle alliances with elves and humans. My ancestors broke those chains.
And forged new ones, Wei said quietly. All attention shifted to the monk, who stood calmly in the center of the platform, staff held vertically before him.
Chains of ignorance, of imbalance. The nexus beneath this mountain grows unstable. The guardian trees sense it, the barriers thin.
More mystical nonsense,
Durnham spat.
Let's see your star-faced Heartrender in fair combat, monk. Let metal prove its superiority once and for all.
Wei nodded.
That is why I came.
The two moved to the center of the platform, the others backing away to form a circle around them. The carved patterns on the floor pulsed with increasing brightness, and Phinia felt the air grow heavy with anticipation. This was it. The moment both Grimna and Wei had foretold. Wood against metal, old against new, balance against dominance. Whatever happened next would reshape more than just the outcome of a tournament. Durnham moved first, Heartrender cutting through the air with frightening speed despite its size. Wei deflected the blow with his staff, the two weapons connecting with that same pure bell-like tone that had sounded in the dining chamber. But here, amplified by the cavern's acoustics and the power of the nexus, the sound became something more, a resonance that vibrated through stone and bone alike. The duel continued, Durnham attacking with increasing fury while Wei maintained his fluid, defensive style. But unlike his previous matches, the monk occasionally struck back, not to harm, but to guide the combat towards some predetermined conclusion that only he could see. With each clash of wood against metal, the platform's patterns glowed brighter. The crystals in the walls pulsed in rhythm with the combat. Phinia felt the floor beneath her feet begin to tremble slightly.
What's happening?
She whispered to Grimna, who had moved to stand beside her.
The nexus awakens,
The old dwarf replied.
the mountain remembers.
The duel reached a crescendo as Durnham, roaring with frustration at his inability to land a decisive blow, raised Heartrender high above his head for a powerful overhand strike that would cleave through stone. Wei planted his feet firmly and raised his staff to meet the blow directly. When the weapons connected, the sound that followed wasn't just a tone, but a physical force that knocked everyone back a step. A blinding light emanated from the point of contact, and through its glare, Phinia saw Heartrender's legendary blade split cleanly in two, its broken half spinning through the air to embed itself in the stone floor with a final, discordant clang. The silence that followed was absolute. Durnham stood frozen, staring in disbelief at the ruined remnant of his legendary weapon. Wei remained in his defensive stance, the staff unmarked. The platform beneath them pulsed once, twice, and then began to glow with a steady, warm light that spread outward along the floor in patterns that resembled the roots of an enormous tree.
It is done,
Wei said simply, lowering the staff. The spell of silence broke. Durnham fell to his knees, still clutching the handle and broken remnant of Heartrender. Some of the dwarven guards dropped to their knees as well, recognizing in the moment something sacred that transcended their orders or allegiances. Thrain, however, was not so moved.
"Seize the human!"
he commanded.
"He has destroyed a most sacred relic through treachery!"
Several guards hesitated, looking uncertainly between their ruler and the display they had just witnessed. But enough moved forward, weapons drawn, that Phinia knew the moment had tipped toward violence.
Run!
She shouted to Wei, interposing herself between him and the approaching guards.
Get back to the tunnels!
Chaos erupted in the chamber. Guards rushed forward while others held back. Thrain shouted commands that were increasingly ignored, and through it all, the platform continued to pulse with that strange root-like pattern of light that seemed to be spreading throughout the chamber. Grimna's voice cut through the confusion, unnaturally loud for one so ancient.
The Forgotten Ones stand with the staff-bearer!
She proclaimed. At her words, several dwarves, guards and attendants alike, moved to form a protective circle around Wei.
"Traitors!"
Thrain snarled.
"You would betray your own kind for ancient superstitions!"
We remember what you chose to forget.
one of the guards replied, removing his helmet to reveal a face marked with subtle tattoos that matched the patterns on the floor.
We're the Forgotten Ones, and we have waited generations for this day.
Phinia, seeing her opportunity in the standoff, grabbed Wei's arm.
This is touching, but we really should leave before someone remembers they outnumber the mystical faction 10-1.
Wei nodded, allowing her to pull him toward one of the exits. Several of the Forgotten Ones moved with them, forming a defensive screen.
The passages will take you to the surface,
Grimna called after them.
The mountain will guide you.
As they fled through tunnels that now pulsed with the same root-like patterns of light, Phinia had to admit that the old dwarf was right. Each time they reached a fork or intersection, one path glowed more brightly than the others, guiding their escape. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of pursuit fade and then transform into something else, a rumbling that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Not a collapse or earthquake, but a deeper, more purposeful movement, as if something enormous was shifting after eons of stillness.
What's happening?
Phinia gasped as they paused in a larger chamber to catch their breath. The Forgotten Ones who had accompanied them, 6 in total, formed a perimeter, watching the entrances.
The nexus rebalances,
Wei explained, his breathing still perfectly controlled despite their flight.
The staff's presence, combined with the symbolic breaking of Heartrender, has reawakened the mountain's awareness. It recognizes the imbalance that has grown over centuries, the over-reliance on one element, one approach, one understanding of power.
And now?
Now change begins. The mountain will gradually reshape itself, bringing forgotten passages to light, sealing others that would cause harm to the nexus. The dwarves will discover ancient chambers filled with knowledge they had lost, if they choose to see it.
One of the Forgotten Ones approached, a female dwarf whose beard was decorated with tiny wooden beads instead of metal.
The way is clear,
she reported.
But we must hurry. Thrain will not surrender power easily, and the initial confusion will soon organize into determined pursuit.
Wei nodded.
Lead on. The staff's work here is done, but there are other nexus points that require attention.
As they continued their journey upward through the mountain, Phinia found herself composing the ballad of what she'd witnessed in her mind. But for once, she felt no need to embellish or exaggerate. The truth itself was strange and wonderful enough.
By the time they reached the surface,
emerging from a long-forgotten exit into a forest clearing bathed in moonlight, word of what had transpired in the heart of Khaz'Gorum had already begun to spread. Dwarves were gathering in small groups, discussing the breaking of Heartrender, the appearance of the root-like patterns of light, and the emergence of the Forgotten Ones from hiding.
What happens now?
Phinia asked as they paused at the edge of the tree line, looking back at the mountain's silhouette against the night sky.
Now we journey to the next nexus point,
Wei replied.
The staff must visit each one, reawakening the forgotten connections, reminding the world of what it once knew.
We?
Phinia raised an eyebrow.
I don't recall volunteering for a mystical pilgrimage.
The monk smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him.
You followed me into the heart of a mountain on the word of a blind dwarf. You risked your life to help a stranger complete a task you barely understood. I think, Phinia the Wanderer, that you have already volunteered.
Phinia opened her mouth to object, then closed it again. He wasn't wrong. Besides, what was the alternative? Return to taverns and village squares, singing about dragons she'd never seen and heroes who'd never lived, after witnessing what she had beneath Khaz'Gorum?
Fine,
she conceded.
But I have conditions. First, when I compose the ballad of this journey, you don't get to complain about artistic license.
Agreed, though I would prefer the truth remain recognizable.
Second, you have to actually explain things as we go. No more cryptic statements about following the staff or the mountain remembering.
Wei inclined his head.
I will try, though some things defy simple explanation.
And third,
Phinia continued.
You have to tell me where we're going next. I prefer to know what I'm walking into, especially if it's likely to involve angry locals with weapons.
The monk looked down at his staff, which glowed faintly in the moonlight. The staff points south and east. There is a forest where the trees never lose their leaves, surrounding a lake that never freezes. The elves once kept a temple there, before they retreated from the world of men.
Elves!
Phinia groaned.
They're even worse than dwarves when it comes to outsiders.
She adjusted her pack and loot.
Well, at least I'll get to see my mother's people. Maybe they'll be marginally less likely to kill me on sight.
As they set off through the moonlit forest, the Forgotten Ones who had accompanied them from the mountain bowed deeply to Wei.
We will spread the word,
their leader promised.
Others like us exist throughout the realms, keeping the old knowledge alive. We will tell them that the staff walks again, and the balance begins to shift.
Wei returned their bow.
May your beards grow ever whiter,
he said, using an ancient dwarven blessing that made their eyes widen in surprise. The small band of dwarves disappeared back into the mountain, leaving Phinia and Wei alone with the night and the journey ahead.
You know,
Phinia said as they walked,
if you told me yesterday I'd be fleeing a dwarven stronghold with a monk and a magical stick after witnessing the breaking of a legendary weapon and the reawakening of a mountain, I would have accused you of stealing my livelihood.
Truth often surpasses the stories we tell about it, Wei replied.
Maybe,
Phinia conceded.
But a good storyteller knows when to let the truth speak for itself.
She looked up at the stars, feeling strangely at peace despite the danger and uncertainty that surrounded them.
And I think this is going to be the best story I've ever told.
As they disappeared into the forest, the moon caught the copper in Phinia's hair, turning it briefly to flame. Behind them, Khaz'Gorum stood silent against the night sky, but within its depths, ancient patterns were beginning to glow, spreading like roots throughout the mountain, connecting what had been severed, reminding the stone of what it had forgotten. And somewhere in those depths, a blind lorekeeper smiled, knowing that the wheel had finally begun to turn again.